Many of you would, if you not only know that Reggie White was one of the greatest defensive players in NFL history, you'd also would know that Reggie White was a Christian. And he was not ashamed of Christ, and he talked about his faith, different places that he went. He would let people know that he was a Christian, also a minister. In fact, he had a nickname. His nickname was the Minister of Defense. And at one point in his career, though, Reggie White became a free agent, and practically every football team in the NFL was after him. And here's what Reggie said. He made it very clear. Reggie made it clear that he would go where God wanted him to go. He would go where God wanted him to go. Well, the manager of the Green Bay Packers and the coach of the Green Bay Packers, they wanted Reggie White to come and play for them. And so they came up with an idea that they were going to call him. And when they placed the call to call him, they got his voicemail, got his answer machine, and here's the message that they left. They said, "Reggie, this is God." Reggie, this is God. I want you to go to Green Bay. Now you think about that. I wish so much that the will of God was that easy. I wish that we'd get a phone call from God and that God would tell us exactly what He'd want for our lives. But I can say this, it's not always that simple. George W. Truett, a preacher of the past, he said this, to know the will of God is the greatest knowledge. To know the will of God is the greatest knowledge. He said to do the will of God is the greatest achievement. So not only to know God's will for my life, for you to know God's will for your life, it's the greatest knowledge, but to do God's will for your life, it is the greatest achievement. And I think that all of us in the room would agree that knowing the will of God would be the greatest knowledge, and doing the will of God would be the greatest achievement. I've had people ask me through the years, well, preacher, how can I know the will of God for my life? And that's a good question. How do we know? How do we know where God wants us to serve? How do we know where God wants us to go and to do and to be and all those things? Well, let me say this. I believe it's very clear that God wants you, God wants me to do His will. That's very clear. That's just foundational, all right? Knowing the will of God and doing the will of God, that is the very foundational thing. And God has established that. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 17, the Bible tells us, "Wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is." God doesn't want us to be unwise. He wants us to understand what the will of the Lord is. Someone said this, if the will of God is the all-important factor in our Christian living, and if our knowledge and execution of His will is the one thing that pleases and glorifies Him, and if our failure to do His will is what blights our testimony and grieves His heart, it is unthinkable that He should refrain from making His will known. Boy, that's true, isn't it? I mean, it would be unthinkable that God would refrain, that God would keep us from knowing what His will is for our lives. Now, so the question would be is how can you and I know the will of God? Well, I can tell you this, okay? There's two simple things. They're not really necessarily simple to do, but it is simple to understand. The first thing would be this, there has to be a complete and total submission to the Lord. If you're going to do the will of God, there has to be a complete and total submission to the Lord that involves a willingness to do anything that God may ask or require of us. And so if we're going to know what the will of God is for our life, then we have to be willing to submit to Him. We have to be willing to submit to Him, and it has to involve a willingness to do anything that God may ask or that God may require of us to do. For instance, when we think about the will of God, some people look at it like this. They might look at it as, I've heard through the years, a car place may say, you know what, you can test drive our vehicle for 30 days, and if you don't like it after or before the 30 days are finished, you can bring it back. Well, that's not how God's will is handled, all right? We have to submit ourselves to the will of God. We have to surrender, and there have to be a submission to do His will, even before we will fully understand what the overall will of God is for our life. And then there's a second thing, not only submitting and the submission of that and being willing to do whatever God would want us to do, but in order to understand God's will for our life, we have to be willing to do what we already know is His will. Now understand this, all right? God may have something unknown to us, but there are things that we know God wants us to do. And before God will show us the unknown, then we have to make sure that we are doing what is known, okay? He won't show us what it is for us to do, the unknown thing, unless we are willing to do the known things that God has for us. For instance, you're there in 1 Peter chapter 2. Let me show you some verses here. Watch this now. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims. Boy, that's a good verse for right this week, isn't it? Strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles. That word conversation means our lifestyle, okay? Our lifestyle ought to be honest among the Gentiles. That whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the what? The will of God. So what we have just read is the known will of God for your life.